My first musical memories are basically from my father's record collection. He was collecting jazz and had brought home some LPs from America as early as 1952, 53, I guess. And and also my parents had some 78s with the Lecona Cuban Boys, Fats Waller and a few others. And then Elvis Presley arrived in 1956, and he became my main favorite, and also Little Richard and Fats Domino. And I bought their records up until the late 50s when Elvis went to the army, and Little Richard started his religious career. It was not that difficult to hear rock and roll recordings from America. They were available on jukeboxes, and the radio might play 1 or 2 songs every week. Elvis Presley was restricted to 1 song every second week on the radio, for example. And you had Radio Luxembourg that were broadcasting, but you could not really hear them loud and clear until 9, 10, 11 o'clock, and that was pretty late when you were 10, 11 years old. And also there might be a ice skating rink that played some records, but in general we were not exposed to this type of music in the 50s. In 1963 I went to England for a language course during the summer, and I was lucky enough to see the Beatles live in Margate, a coast resort town in the south of England. And they were quite good, much better than anything I'd seen before. And also the other English groups, like Billy J. Kramer, for example, they were also quite interesting, I felt. So back home I bought a tape recorder and started recording the music played on the radio. And they now had a more professional, the disc jockeys in Sweden were more professional, and they were playing more up-to-date music and followed the scene better. And also on Radio Luxembourg there were a lot of good music. And the next year when I came to England again, I heard like Manfred Mann, Pretty Things, the Tridents with Jeff Beck playing Barefooted, John Mayall, and those groups were very good, I felt, and the songs they played were quite good. But I soon discovered that they were cover groups and played American blues recordings, originals from the 50s. So pretty soon I started buying Muddy Waters, Elmore James, Howlin' Wolf, John Lee Hooker, and other blues artists from the 50s. And also listening to the radio, and all the time recording on my tape recorder, trying to stay ahead of the scene. And even started subscribing to an English musical weekly, Record Mirror, that had a lot of reviews, so I could I got the record numbers, and I knew how to order the records directly from England in many cases. And also in '65 I was back too, and continued my interest in music in England. Late in 1964 I heard Otis Redding on the Swedish radio. I think it was That's How Strong My Love Is, and also James Brown, the B-side to Out of Sight, maybe the last time. So I started buying soul records, even more than the blues recordings, and I was lucky enough to see the teenage American international movie with James Brown at the Swedish cinema, where it was running for 1 week only for a very limited crowd. But the real important event was definitely the Stax Volt tour, which arrived in Sweden in 1967. That was a fantastic show, the best I had seen so far, and the best I've seen since. Top performers, everything was just fantastic. So I made up my mind to go to America as soon as possible and see more soul artists live. And in early June of 1968, I arrived in New York and went to the Apollo Theater immediately. That was one of the few addresses I had in America. The other two were Chess Records in Chicago and Stax at East Macklemore in Memphis. And I was fortunate enough to meet mentors also during my trip. I met George Leaner in Chicago, who gave me a long list of important people. Estelle Axton in Memphis took care of me and drove me around. And in Houston, Evelyn Johnson, chief of the Buffalo booking agency and working at Duke Records, took care of me there. And I saw some fantastic shows with, for example, Tina Turner, Ike and Tina Turner in Los Angeles, and also an interesting performance by Michael Jackson in Chicago with his brothers. And this was about 1 year before he was discovered by the Tamla Motown label. I was at home with the Hugh Piano Smith. I was looking for Professor Longhair in New Orleans, and eventually met his greatest disciple. And there were some fantastic shows I saw during my 83-day long tour, visiting altogether 10 cities. In Chicago, I went to a school concert. There was an unannounced guest that night. It was a gospel concert, and the artist turned out to be Mahalia Jackson. And when she started singing, the people went absolutely crazy. Or that I thought, people started fainting and screaming. And I realized that if you grew up in this type of musical environment, and if you're trained to sing to such an audience, you are really on a different level than what I was used to from Europe. Your audience is more demanding, and they expect more, and you also give much more. So I realized the importance of gospel, and I also, after a few years, realized that gospel is really the foundation of American music, because all since the Negro spirituals in the 150 years ago, it's been a mainstream of American music, and especially black music. Back home in Sweden, I continued buying records. I wrote articles for English soul magazines and started writing for the Swedish blues magazine. And I also became more and more interested in the history of soul music, or the history of rhythm and blues after World War II, and bought more and more records, and eventually realized that there was really nothing available of that type of music. There were plenty of blues reissues, but no rhythm and blues reissues. And of course I started developing new favorites, which were basically the favorites of my old favorites. For example, the inspiration on James Brown, Archie Brownlee and Roy Brown. And I also liked Billy Wright, the favorite.